Welcome to Reward Nerds, the podcast that deep dives into the areas of compensation and benefits. My name is Jon, and I'm your host, and I'm your fellow Reward Nerd.
So this episode of Reward Nerds is going to be all about the Pay Transparency Directive. My name is Marie. I'm a partner at Nordic Reward Partners.
And my name is Jon, and I'm the founder of Nordic Reward Partners. We're looking very much forward to nerding with you. We are basically saying that this is, the EU Pay Transparency Directive is going to be something that many of our listeners has heard about already. And if you haven't, welcome. But if you have, we're going to put some more perspectives on it. We think it's important to basically frame this to understand why on earth do we have a directive coming up in 2026 that really is about stuff that a lot of people are saying, isn't this already law? And put that a bit into perspective. But getting that perspective in is key. We need to understand this in a setting. I'll make some examples along the way. The story around the directive as to why is this in all of a sudden a gender-based directive, which in reality it is. So we'll touch upon that too, to understand what is this and why is the transparency piece so vital. Why is this not just an equal pay directive? It is a pay transparency directive. So we'll touch upon all of these things. We'll, of course, go into what it means and what are the key elements of the directive, and also our understanding, basically, of some of these things. We have had, I would say, at the very least, 100-plus conversations with 100-plus companies around this. Probably even 200 or 300 the past year and a half or two. So this is something we have talked about a lot and gotten plenty of great perspectives from huge corporations to smaller ones to understand what kind of concerns they're having. We've talked to politicians, and we're trying to all the time be on top of the developments on this. So we'll touch upon all of these things during this episode. We'll go quite a lot into depth. So I think you should grab yourself a cup of coffee as a listener and really just sit back and listen in.
Yeah, so the directive basically falls into 4 different episodes or categories. The first one is everything to do with recruitment. Then we have a chapter on salary and career. We have a chapter on what, to my perspective, is the most important part of it, which is the employee's right to information. And this is a true game changer. And then the final part of this is the reporting requirements. So we're going to start with recruitment because that is sort of where everything starts. It's the employee life cycle starts with the recruitment. And the basic requirements in the directive is that you need to know before you enter into the salary negotiations around a new job, what does the company expect to pay you for this position? So basically, you as a company would need to provide salary bands in your job ads. You're also prohibited as a company to ask the candidate, what do you expect? What is your current salary? What is your pay history? And what do you expect to get in this position? And also, you can no longer create contracts that include pay secrecy clauses. So these are the major points. But from a rewards perspective, what does that do for you as a company?
Yeah, so I think it's, first of all, so we'll dig into this quite a bit of detail now, because as you mentioned, these are kind of the key elements of it. And then people could be challenging, is this 100% correct? Do you need to show a salary range? Do you need to do it in the job ad? And so we'll put a few words on that. So let me start there, actually, because, again, the legislation has not been implemented yet. The directive is not yet into play. So we can get some inspiration from countries that has had some similar legislation going on and see what have they actually been doing. So if we address that first, what do we actually see? So there are a number of states in the U.S. that have had somewhat similar legislation, and we can just practically see that the companies are showing it in the job ads. So they're showing a salary range in the job ad. And, I kind of like to. I need to name and shame a little bit in this podcast. We're not, restricted by so many things, so we're going to be doing a little bit of that to some extent. Well-known cases, that is, and everyone knows Netflix, and they I think it's a typical example of something that trying to stretch the rules. To be fair, so they had an advertisement for a job where they did put in a salary range. They even called it a typical range. And they basically said it's between $90,000 and $900,000 for that position, typically, right? And to me, yes, that's a salary range, but it's also a joke. It doesn't really make any sort of sense. Whereas you had on the other side, also a tech company, Spotify, were very specific in their job ads. So they basically, and again, the same legislation in the background. They said it's $114,000 something specifically for a certain position. They even included how many holidays days would you be having, and a 401k plan, and what have you. So they went specific. And I think that's kind of what we will see is somebody will try to, whatever we're talking about now, somebody will try to stretch things in one direction, and some are going to be super compliant and even go further. And we've also, so that's the U.S. perspective of things. We have also seen the U.K. has had somewhat similar laws in for some time. And again, we see salary ranges. We have even seen cases of UK-based companies that are in other European countries. We've even seen it in Denmark, where we're sitting, where they were advertising for a position. And suitingly, it was a rewards position, which said it was 700,000 Danish to 870,000 Danish as a range. So I think that's the kind of stuff we'll be seeing. Now, formally, you do not have to put it in the job ad, right? You could, in theory, just inform the candidates prior to the first interview, and you can do so by email or what have you. I think practically, though, that is going to be a big burden, and it's not going to be it's not going to be the norm. So that's kind of on the formal side. What do you have to do? And the second thing is it necessarily to have a range, or could you start with the minimum salary of saying it's going to be above this point? That's also a little bit up for discussion, a bit up to an interpretation. Again, we are recording now in the beginning of 25, and I think it was even on Christmas Eve of 24 that Poland came up with their not the suggestion, but it's like a working document in the parliament. And there they basically suggested that you would show not the range, but the minimum and maximum of the position. And I can't even start to discuss how many things that will open in terms of potential challenges for the companies. So we'll deep dive into these things now. And so if we just take that one specifically, what do you do? So the job ad is out there and you choose to do a range. Let's just assume that's going to be the norm. The dilemmas are already starting, right? So what kind of range are we talking about? Should it be narrow? Should it be specific? Should it be broad? You probably shouldn't do a full Netflix. Maybe you shouldn't have just one number. So it's the dilemma of how can you attract the right candidates that you want to have, not knowing exactly what kind of salary expectations they have. And again, the starting point is it's the company that comes out with the range. The dilemmas you have are multifold. Number one, the market may have been moving faster or different than you anticipated, so you actually misjudge what it costs to get hold of a position like this in the market. So that could be one where you are missing out on candidates that you otherwise would be willing to pay for, but you somehow came up with the wrong range. So it sets a lot of demand or expectations that the company needs to know what kind of range is out there. And the second one, which is, I think, equally important or even more important, is how does this match your current range for people with similar positions to the one you're advertising? And dwelling on that one is it's a huge dilemma, because every single company we talk to, they have a spread in positions. They have some people, obviously there's always going to be one that's the highest and the lowest paid, but the difference between them could be vast. So how do you tackle it if you're setting a minimum and a maximum, but the reality is you have people in the company that are paid lower and higher than what you're advertising? What's the reaction going to be? If you choose to go with a range that is very, very narrow, you can have plenty of people that are below the lowest part that you mentioned. I cannot imagine a single situation where these people will not react. Right? They will go to their manager and say, hey, I just saw this advertisement. I'm as such okay with my salary, but this looks strange. How come I'm being paid less than a random person, basically, from the external market that's been recruited to a position that's similar to mine? So you get that dilemma. And this really puts a lot of pressure on companies to have a really good job architecture. First of all, we're going to have a specific episode on job architecture. But they need to have that. The leveling needs to be very clear. But they basically also need to have a very clear pay policy and a communicated one, dealing with outliers at an early stage. And this is just the first piece, right? This is just the recruitment piece. So maybe we can just even touch upon why is this happening? And we've been talking, again, to a lot of companies and also to politicians around this. So what could be the reason for having a demand such as this one? And one is research basically overall base that shows that women are less, you could say, aggressive when it comes to demands. And if you get into a company in with the wrong salary, you could say, or too low a salary, you will basically never catch up. So it is important to get that one right. So that's one bias that basically is out there. So the company may be willing to pay a certain number, but the candidate potentially, if you take many candidates, then the average female candidate would demand less than the average male candidate. So even though this company may want to go for pay equity, they somehow are being met with different demands from the market. So that's interesting. So in theory, you could have equal pay in the company, but people are coming from the outside, and you kind of inherit the differences they have from the last company they came from, or the cultural biases. So that was me talking a lot already on this. There is more to mention. But I think somehow, it's important to say that, yes, you need to understand the external market to get a range that makes sense. But this is an internal exercise first and foremost. You really need to make sure it makes sense internally. Otherwise, you're going to get a beehive of issues, as we sometimes say. So for the recruitment part, again, to sum that one up a bit, it is about practically, again, not formally, but practically will be in the job ads. And you're not allowed to ask the candidates of their current pay or pay history, but you can indeed ask about their pay expectation. But only after you as a company have showed the range. So that's kind of to me, it's one of those discussions that we can nerd around, why on earth would you practically ask people about their pay expectations after you have shown the range? So again, back to that's kind of, I think, with this podcast, yes, we will touch upon the formal requirements, but we also need to be pragmatic here and say, yes, it is true you could skip, announcing this in the job ad, but practically we think you wouldn't. You can ask the person about their pay expectation, but practically, again, as you need to show the range first, you just wouldn't. And so that's kind of the nature of how this discussion will be. We'll take the actual cases, but we'll try to put them into a perspective of what is actually happening.
Mm. And one thing I think is important to mention is that there is a big difference between the public sector and the private sector in terms of how big is this issue? How big is the gender pay gap? For example, in Denmark, we've had in the public sector, we've had a gender-neutral collective bargaining agreements since 1919, but we didn't see a similar one, a gender-neutral bargaining agreement on the private sector before 1973. And in this time, the private market actually had a rule of thumb that said a woman should be paid about 2/3 of a man because the man is the breadwinner. And this is sort of the historical or the traditional burden that is what this directive is trying to get rid of or to deal with, because you have all of this history about how we've done things over the past generations, and that may have made sense at some point, but now we're in 2025. Does it still make sense? No, it doesn't, right? I mean, we've had pay equity laws in the European Union since 1973, right? So all of my lifetime, and yet we're still facing a gender pay gap. And this to me is interesting. And it's interesting to look at why is it less in the public sector and higher in the private sector? Well, that's because the public sector have had rules around this for a longer time. So then you would think, well, okay, they have collective bargaining agreements. Then there shouldn't be any gender pay gap in the public sector, but there still is. And it's about 6%. So even though we do have a lot of rules, regulation that combats this, it still exists. So why is this important? Is because when we look at the beginning of a career, you have a woman and a man, and they're in the beginning of their 20s, and they apply for a similar job, and they have a similar salary, and everything looks very similar. It's gender neutral. But then over time, we see that this changes. And over time, the gender pay gap increases, right? And why does it increase? And this is where it becomes, I think, really interesting. And this is due to a lot of, traditions and also, external requirements from society that women take on more of the unpaid labor, both at home, but also typically at the workplace. We have a lot of women take on maybe part-time positions to juggle children and maybe elderly parents, all of these things. And that then translates into their pay history. So if you've had a number of maternity leaves where, you weren't there for the promotion, you weren't there for the salary increase, then the next time you go out and you want to have a new job, and you're back to this guy who, when you were young and you applied for the same position, you were equals. Now, because of the pay history that you carry in your backpack as a woman, because of maternity leaves and everything like that, then when you're asked, what is your pay history? It's going to be a lower number. And this is what we want to prevent from happening. This is why we're moving away from looking at the person to looking at the position. So with the Pay Transparency Directive, and honestly, from a rewards perspective, this isn't news, right? But still, apparently, it is news to people outside of rewards that we're going to look at the position, the chair, and not the person.
Yeah, and I think many things opening from those comments, right? So one thing is now you're talking about the position, and that's the one where you basically need to have objective criteria of saying if the position is, identical is easy then if you have identical positions, but it also work of similar value, and we'll get into some of those definitions, which is tricky. But if you're basically doing the same job at the same level, at same quality, etc., then the starting point should be the same. Now, it's important to say this is not a directive. That means you need to pay everyone the same, because there can still be differences in performance. It's differences in how you kind of fill that chair, and that is okay. You just need objective criteria, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to have a very narrow actual pay range. It could be very broad. You could pay somebody double in theory. You just need to have very, very good reasons as to why that is the case. And it kind of takes us straight over to, I think, the salary and career piece in a sense, because this is really I think it's super interesting, because it basically is a pay progression policy. It's a promotion policy thing, and when we look at a number of companies now in 2025 and these years, we very often see that if we take the private sector, we're going to mostly talk about the private sector. That's the one we know. It's the area that has rewards people in it. So that's what we're going to touch upon the most, just to put that into it. But when we see private companies recruiting, young professionals, it is roughly 50-50 gender-wise. Some areas, both tech and law, etc., actually sometimes have a plus 50% female population of the young candidates. But that's not the overall number in the company. And that could lead to saying, all right, well, that means it's going to be fixed over time then. But reality is it doesn't seem like it will unless something happens. And I just want to make an example to start this off. I've been working, with rewards the past 20 plus years. And in 2004 and 2005, I was working for one of the big global consultancies, and I made salary statistics in Norway as one of the places. And we did analysis for the Norwegian IT sector together with the branch organization. And it was made on this objective criteria kind of thing. We had levels and made regression analysis. And I made some comparisons between men and women on this. And it even came to the news and the big media around, how is the pay with the women and men versus each other when we had taken into consideration their levels and used, again, a regression methodology. So we kind of nerded it from the offset. And the difference in pay when you looked at the exact same level based on the regression methodologies was 5% back in 2004, 2005. And, back then, around half of the companies, primarily the HR directors were female. And I interviewed every single one of them to understand how this could be. And basically around half of them said that they didn't back then give salary increases to women when they were on maternity leave. Now, this has changed. Most companies have policies and some countries have laws that basically says you have to give the average salary increase to the females when they're on maternity leave, etc. But back then, that wasn't really the case. Only happened to around half of the companies. Now, then we fast forwarded 17 years. I made the exact same statistics for the exact same group now in the setting of this company. And then I was really keen to see how does this look now, And then all of a sudden, 17 years later, again, the Norwegian IT industry, I would assume, do not, have policies that on purpose favor men over women. But fast forwarding 17 years, as I said, we went from a 5% difference to 4.8 in 17 years, right? And then that was on base pay. And then when we looked at including bonuses, it was 5.2. So reality, nothing changed in 17 years. And I'm certain that the big, IT companies, they all have policies in place that they want to have pay equity. Of course they do. And somehow this still happens. So I think it's an interesting one that we're going to be digging a bit into. And so just to mention some of these things, one is the actual bias situation. We know that from all kind of research. There is a bias. People tend to promote people that are similar to themselves. You can have individual managers where it's not the case, but if you take the big numbers game, it is happening. So if you already had a majority of male leaders 17 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 1 year ago, over time they promote more men than they do females. So that's one that you need to be aware of. The second is around, again, we need to, when it comes to this, need to take some overall general assumptions. We know there are deviations from this, but the overall one is also that females tend to, overall with big numbers, to be more strict on if they see a requirement for a job, they kind of need to fulfill 110% of that, or at least 90% of the requirements, both when they apply for the jobs and when they think about promotions, whereas males go for a smaller percentage. And thereby you kind of end up with more male candidates And that could then be the reasoning or the justification from the hiring manager that's the reason. The talent pool was in favor of men, and they end up hiring more men for promotions or for new positions. So that's a tricky one to solve. Now, what needs to happen in this part around salary and career is around looking at what is the pay progression policy, so it's clear. And I'm going to have another 2-minute talk about that specifically later on in a few seconds, but because I have some very clear views in terms of that. And the other one is around the criteria as to what it takes to get promoted. What's really the difference between, let's just say, a senior engineer and a lead engineer, or what's the difference between a senior manager and a director, that kind of stuff. So I'm just pausing for a second to make sure I'm not just going on here.
I mean, this is what is. It's not actually new. We've had equal pay laws since 1976, but transparency is what is, the new kid in town.
Yeah.
And the reason why transparency is relevant is because it empowers women to take more responsibility for their own career progression. And with the directive, a woman gets the right to know what does it take to go from one level to the next level. What does it take to achieve the higher salary within this salary range? Well, men get the same right to know, but I mean, this is what is the new point of it, is that it needs to be visible. And the companies need to actively tell their employees, this is how you can build your career. This is how you can get from point A to point B within our company. This is what it takes. And they have to inform employees about this right at least once a year. And so this empowers the employee to take responsibility, to take the power back, in a sense. So it kind of changes the dynamic between the employer and the employee. And that kind of leads over to the third pillar of the directive, which is the employee's right to information. And this is the one where I find that this is going to be the biggest game changer. And I think this is, as a female, this is where I get really, really excited, because I think this is really where it will make a difference. And this is the reason why I think that the Pay Transparency Directive will be the key to solving the gender pay gap.
Yeah, and I think we were going to dig into the right to information because it's super, super important, and more important, frankly, in my view anyway, than the rest put together. But I want to still touch upon the salary and career piece a little bit more first. And it's because promotions happen in many different ways. We talked again about maternity leaves, what happens with salary regulation. Now, that's been solved many places, legal requirements and policies of the companies. What hasn't been solved is, the career progression piece. So as long as females have a longer maternity leave than men have paternity leave, this will keep on being an issue that men are there physically and the females are not at the same point of time. And all of a sudden there's a job opening, some leader leaves. And you may say the right thing could potentially be and should be in many ways to say who is the right candidate for that. And that may be the person on maternity leave. But realistically, if the person is out for a year, how many companies do really promote that individual for that position? Now, we hear about it happening for sure, absolutely. But it's always celebrated as the exception, and that's a progressive company doing it. So that's a very tricky one to solve, because, frankly, it isn't easy to do either. I would personally also find it very, very difficult. If you're missing a leader and you see you have two candidates, one is maybe slightly better than the other one, but one is there and the other one is gone for a year. How do you make that choice to go for the female person who's not there, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one. The other one is when it comes to promotions. And this is really out to all of you dealing with this today. This is not necessarily about the directive itself, but how do you do it? What kind of increase do you do when you actually promote people? Because then all of a sudden, salary history is a thing. So you can imagine that you've been underpaid versus your peers, for 3 or 4 or 5%, doesn't have to be a big number. But when a promotion happens, a lot of companies give, promotions and salary increases in percentages, which to me is kind of interesting, because if you have a new position opening, a leader, you could do one of two things, or one of three things. One, you could choose not to, again, have anyone in that position. Okay, but let's assume you need to refill the position. You could either recruit externally, and then you basically go for typically the market median, and that's what you give to what essentially is a random candidate. Anyone from the outside who fulfills the requirements, you're willing to pay the median. But internally, you end up looking at very often their current salary, and a lot of companies are restricting this to say like they cannot get more than a 10% increase or what have you, but they're looking into the salary history of the individual. So whether that person is overpaid or underpaid as a starting point, it kind of just gets more so. Whereas why, in reality, do companies not look at the same market median, if that's their policy, and say whether or not that's a 2% increase or 19% increase for the individual is actually not relevant. It's the number for the position. If they fulfill the requirements in the same way as an external candidate, why would you not do the same? So that's something that really could push things, because I think otherwise you keep on having, if you're behind by a couple of percentages due to, a maternity leave or a smaller salary regulation at some point in many years ago, it will follow you, right?
Yeah, and you're getting punished for being loyal to your company.
And that, yeah. So I think on salary and career, that kind of sums up some of the dilemmas. And to be back to saying, all right, the formal requirements is you need to have objective criteria, you need to have it gender neutral, and it needs to be understood by everyone internally. So this cannot be, as in everything else here, this cannot just be a hidden document in HR, hidden document in comp&ben and rewards. Employees needs to know about this. It needs to be readily available in a language that's understood. So it needs to be very, very clear what the criteria are, and they need to be gender neutral, and they also need to be clear in terms of pay policies, what you do, how do you do it, and then you can ask yourself when you're listening to this, do I have a very clear pay policy that I'm ready to communicate, or do you need to make sure that actually it comes in place? Good. So I think that's what we're going to say on that topic until we come to think about something else around that, and then move on to right to information, because that's a big topic.
Yeah. I think, as I said, this is probably the most exciting for me as a woman. The most exciting part of this directive, because it gives me the right to know how does my salary compare to not just people that have the same job as me, but people who contribute the same value to my company as I do across all the company. So having this right to information empowers me to be able to go out and negotiate a more fair salary. It also, knowledge is power, basically, is what it's about, right? The companies have to respond to the question, how does my pay compare? And, it can be the employee that asks, but it could also be the union asking on behalf of the employee. A workers' representative has the right to ask. So I think this is going to be where we will see the most, for lack of a better word, drama with the directive. And this is where the companies really need to be prepared. And regardless if you're prepared or not, this right becomes a right on June 7th, 2026. And then you have a very short time to be able to answer when your employees start asking. So how does my pay compare to the average of my category of workers?
Yeah. And I think we kind of owe everyone to comment on the fact that this is about gender. We have been challenged on this as to saying, well, how on earth can that be that this is gender only? We challenged the European Parliament. We talked to the chief negotiators in the Parliament to ask directly, why is this gender only? Because in a way, it is meant to be an anti-discrimination, and that's what we should strive for. But it's not again, the European Union is 27 member states, different political climates, different laws, different everything. And then you end up with a directive that is then, of course, a number of things that needs to be agreed upon across. So there's not number one, there's not a legal basis for taking this broader than gender. That's kind of a full stop. You cannot have information on religion. You cannot have religion and a number of other factors in a number of countries for both historical reasons and otherwise. So as long as there is no legal basis, that's of course no reason to go further practically. And there is also not a political will to do so in the places where there isn't something prohibiting it in terms of legal basis. So I think that's key to say. So that's the reason we're mentioning gender all the time, because that is what is practically being measured. With that, we still, if we're looking at objective criteria, there is no reason to limit that in practical terms of saying it is about gender, because if you have objective criteria as to why you have a certain policy of pay and a certain starting point for pay, then the rest is down to performance and how you act and what you do. And whether or not that is potentially discriminating versus gender or it's something else, it will just be an additional factor. So I think that's just key to say. So it's not because we are obsessed with the gender thing here. This could certainly also do with the sexuality. It could do with religion. It could be a cultural background. It could be handicaps, etc. But as long as you have an objective policy, it should basically entail all of these scenarios. But what's get measured gets done, you could say. So we think the biggest impact will be on gender. That's where people have to kind of adjust and report. So with that said, the right to information. You mentioned already average. So I'll have to take that one first because it's such a big theme. Frankly, it is one of the strange things that is seen as a bit of a mistake on the European Union side. So the employee's right to information is to get the right to get information on the average pay on people in the same position as themselves or work of equal value. And they get so by getting the overall average for the group. They get the average for the males and the average for the females. And of course, they have their own number in this. I think that the fellow nerds out there will already think, well, shouldn't that be a median? And yes, it should. And no, it's not. So that's a bit of an issue, and the reason for that, just to clarify that, is because every single company has a number of outliers for good and bad reasons, and the smaller the sample or smaller the population we're looking at, the bigger impacts that outlier may have. And the second part is because of outliers. There's always a limit as to how low an outlier you can have, but there's not really a limit as to how high they can be. So they impact it in a way that means that every single company I ever looked at, they have averages that are higher than the medians. And with the median, half the population or half the group or half the incumbents is below that point, right? But with average, it could be 60% that is below. And that just means that if 60% of your individuals in the company get a feeling that they're being paid less than they should because they're below that number that they get, that's an issue, right? Because how many people will... You could accept that you're below average, of course. You may be new to the position. There may be good objective reasons that you agree to. But for a lot of people, they will think this doesn't feel right. The hygiene factor you talk about, it just doesn't feel right to be paid below average. You know, over time, most people feel that they're at least average. And so that's going to be an issue. And I think in terms of legal rights, It is more if a gender, doesn't matter which one, of course, is being paid below the other one. And there are no objective criteria as to why this is the case, and the company cannot prove that this is not because of gender. They potentially get the right to get the average salary with back pay. Big case in itself versus GDPR, etc. How many years? There's not a limitation.
And the burden of proof falls on the company to prove that you're not discriminating based on gender.
Yes. But just one point I wanted to make on this is that's the formal piece of it, right? So, but the impact on the company is wider. Because let's just assume overall, and again, it looks like with the companies we looked at that there is a real gender pay gap in most companies, not a huge one, 2 or 3 or 4% in many cases, and sometimes up to around 10%. But in many cases, it's below the 5%, the magic 5%. So the formal right is for if a gender is kind of below the average, and then you could potentially have some rights if the company cannot prove that this is because of other factors than gender and objective criteria. But there is this point I just want to make on saying that's the formal piece of it, right? But then on top of that, it's people's behavior. So in a case where the females are being paid lower than the males in a group, they might be the ones with some rights to potential adjustments. But there's probably also a number of male individuals in this group that's being paid below average. They do not have a formal right in the directive. But I assume that many of these will still talk to the manager and say, hey, dear manager, you have told me I'm paid fine in this group. I can see I'm paid below average. I'm certainly not performing below average. And you know, my background or my experience certainly is not below average. I think we're going to need to have a conversation. So I think the pressure is twofold. It's not just, you could say just, but it's not just based on the directive. So the right to information, we both agree this is big. It's about, again, the individual having the right to know what it looks like, what is the average salary for others in similar positions to me. And, you know, to summarize that, I think, and maybe even the most important point around this will be transparent, and it is a right that everyone has, but it's also the obligation of the company to proactively inform about this right. Because we have heard people telling us, well, isn't this just going to be like GDPR? You know, people also have the right to get information if they want to around the GDPR policies and how do you store my data, etc. First of all, this is to me completely different. This is emotional stuff. It's the entire transaction of being employed in a company. In the end, it is the pay that they're giving you. That's the thank you for doing the work that you're doing. And the fact that this is actually going to, and it impacts people, right? You know, if the number is slightly different, that could be what is ending up in an okay or not okay to be able to buy the apartment you're looking for or what have you. So it is a real impact on people. So that's the one. But the other one is this proactive information that needs to come out. So just imagine again, you know, if it's the CEO or HR director sending out an email to all employees once a year saying, dear employees, as you know, you have this right to get the information about average salaries of positions similar to your own, best regards, top management. And then to me, it's like imagining getting that email. If I wasn't a rewards nerd, where I do know what the numbers should be, but in other cases, you know, receiving that email, I think that a lot of people would be thinking, okay, I still find it a little bit difficult to ask, but they may, you know, just formulate an email to the manager and say, dear manager, as you know, I'm happy with my job. I'm actually even happy with my salary, but I just received this email. I kind of got curious. Just this one time, I just want to know. I'm curious. What is it? And then it's going to be such a difficult thing for this manager then, if it turns out the individual is paid below average. You know, they say they were quite happy with their position and the salary, but in all of a sudden they get information that shows they're being paid less than average. And most people are not going to be happy with that, right? So, and think about the tough conversations if they have just had a salary adjustment, a few months back, and maybe the conversation was, we only have a budget for this and that, and by the way, you're fine within our ranges, and it turns out they're not really. So that also becomes one of these trust issues that could come out of it. So we really urge companies to take one step forward now, as soon as possible, in order to prepare for this, because they really need, and that will probably be a different episode around how can you own the narrative, but that needs to happen. As a company, you need to take a stand on these things, and ideally you have everything ready prior so you know how to tackle this. There are even good ways, and we can talk about that again in such an episode, some tips, you could say, as to how could you potentially do this. You're still fully obliging to all laws, but you also can actually make sure that you can get out of this in a situation which is less tricky than this whole average situation. So that's the right to information. That's a big ticket item, isn't it?
It is. And it shows that you really also need time to prepare. You need time to train your managers to have the conversation. You need to make sure that all of your managers understand the difference between the median and the average. And, owning your narrative doesn't just mean you owning your narrative. It means every single middle manager needs to own the same narrative and needs to understand and be able to explain to employees the difference between average and median and why it's more relevant to look at the median and why their pay is right and fair.
Yeah, and if we take the big corporate hat on for a second, frankly, not many people will say, hey, I just saw I'm above average. Could you please reduce my salary? Right? So since that doesn't happen a lot, this will lead to some sort of mini inflation in the individual companies. It's difficult to see a different scenario, honestly. So if this leads to some sort of an additional budget for increases where you tackle certain issues, of course you have some outliers, you could fix those. It doesn't necessarily impact the big numbers so much. But if all companies somehow end up with a slightly bigger increase, this is just my statement, and my fear is that this will actually potentially impact overall inflation in the country. But that's big politics, so let's not go there. But in the end, you need to find a way where this can be sustainable for the companies. Within each company, how do you tackle this? You have the budgets you have the profit margins you have. You need to protect some sort of a profit margin. You have obligations towards your shareholders and what have you. So that's the big part on the employees' right to information.
And you said, own your narrative as being the one key element that you want to recommend the company top management to do to prepare for this. And that kind of takes us into reporting, because here you also need to own your narrative. And seen from a marketing perspective, being able to use that narrative, to use this reporting actively to show that you are a fair employer, that can be a game changer in recruitment. So it's not just an HR thing. This can be company-wide. There's a lot of potential in using the reporting and this upcoming legislation more proactively. It doesn't have to be just compliance. We can actually use it to drive growth in the company, to be the more attractive employer. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Maybe when listening to this episode, people will think that we're kind of talking about all the negatives, all the risks associated with this, and there are some, certainly, and they need to tackle these risks to make sure you mitigate the risks. I mean, that's just good corporate policies and procedures. At the same time as actually fixing something that should have been fixed years ago. So there's that, but then there's also the thing of saying, okay, so you're fixing something that should be fixed. Hopefully that will be the outcome, and not just inflation, but actually fair pay, while still being able to differentiate based on performance, for example. So this isn't about everyone having the same pay. It's about having a fairness as to what the criteria are. So I think that's taking that over to the reporting piece. How do you, as you said, how do you make this into a story that actually it's not a fake story? That's not what we're recommending. We're recommending you get the right story out and you do the right actions. But when you do so, make sure you get something positive out of it. You owning that narrative is absolutely key. But when we're looking at the reporting requirements, so just to be clear with everyone, so June 2026 at the latest, all the things we just mentioned come into play. Whereas a year later, then the companies above 250 employees. Now, we're not going to go into the details of the requirements in terms of how many employees needs to do what when. And the reason for that is not because we don't know, but it's because we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because the legal requirements per country are not yet ready. We have the minimum requirements ready, but the actual local implementation, this is where we think we'll see the biggest differences. Again, the way it's written at the moment is that companies with more than 100 employees needs to do X, Y, and Z. More than 250, you need to do it every year, and all of these kinds of things. And the smallest companies needs to report later than the bigger ones. This, I think, will depend on what it will be per country. We also see indications from countries such as France in that they will lower the number to potentially all the way down to companies with more than 10 employees. We hear more or less the same kind of story both for Portugal and Spain, that maybe it's 50 that's going to be the threshold. So let's not go into the numbers in itself. But for the companies that do need to report, then we should just look at a little bit as to what that looks like. And we also don't know exactly how it's going to be published, but I think we can get some inspiration as well. So I think Australia is an interesting example. There's a governmental website where you can basically search up any company and you can see what the pay gap looks like. And I'm not sure if this is an urban legend within the rewards community, but I got a statement recently that once that site was up, it was the most searched site of the normal sites out there, and people love researching this, right? So it does get a lot of attention once it's out.
Yeah, and you previously in the episode you mentioned the magical 5%, and I think maybe we should touch upon. What is the magical 5%? Why is it magical? What does it do? Why is 5% important here?
Yeah, so first I think sometimes a percentage has to be agreed as to what is so-called acceptable differences. I don't think there's going to be a single company that is at exactly par, because that will practically mean you're paying everyone exactly the same salary at a certain level, which I think very, very few will do. So the question is, what is then the right number? When do you discriminate systematically and when don't you? And whether that is 1% or 2% or 5% or 10%, now in the legislation it's set to 5% as being saying you have to be lower than 5% within any category of workers. So I think that's the first one we need to touch upon is a lot of companies are making the first analysis. They may have, levels in place, and thereby they're saying, let's look at work of equal value. They come up with an index of, let's just say, 95.5, and it looks like they have a pay difference of 4.5%, and they're kind of within the green area. So that's the first overall number. If you're above 5% here as an overall number, you obviously have to dig deeper. But since it's called within any category of workers, this could be on any individual level or whatever kind of way that you cut and slice your data. So even if you are, let's say, with a 4.5% difference overall as a company, you likely have issues in certain levels. If it's your lowest levels or highest levels, but it's probably not uniform of 4.5 everywhere. So that's the first one to need to be able to dig into. Where do you have these issues? And then what happens in the areas where you have more than a 5% difference? It doesn't mean necessarily you have a problem, but you need to analyze it. You need to figure out, are there objective criteria to be where you are. And you need to publish this data. And I just think that for every time something is published, then whatever explanation you have is difficult to actually convey. It's difficult to get that message out. You can explain a lot of things internally. You can explain a lot of things in town halls. You can explain on the intranet. It's very difficult to explain externally if what people see basically is a dashboard and just numbers. And the numbers will start speaking for themselves, fairly or no.
And there's also a communications task that lies ahead of the companies, is that, there's the gender pay gap, but in rewards, we differentiate between the unexplained gender pay gap and the explained gender pay gap. So basically, the unexplained gender pay gap can be large, but the problem arises if the explained gender pay gap is large, because that's when you take into consideration all of the explanatory factors that are gender neutral. So if you're left with a pay gap of more than 5%, once you have factored in all of the explanatory factors that are gender neutral, then you have an equal pay gap. And it's the equal pay gap that's unfair. But I think this is something that's, people or society as a whole needs to get a vocabulary about it. Like we need to start learning, what is the difference between these two? Because at the moment, a lot of people are just talking about the gender pay gap. And every time I hear somebody say, well, there's a gender pay gap, I'm sitting there thinking, well, but is it the unexplained or the explained gender pay gap? Is it an equal pay gap? Or is it simply a gender pay gap? Or what is it, So there's a communications task in that we need to sort of educate everyone on, how do you tell the difference? What does it mean? Because we say, well, there's an unexplained gender pay gap across Europe of, I think, 12.7%. Well, that's bad, and you can get very annoyed with that. But then if you look at the explanatory factors, then maybe that pay gap is lower. And maybe there's a fair and gender neutral explanation, which could be, in what type of role is it, what type of position. If we're talking about the 12.7% gender pay gap across Europe, it's also, because women tend to have some types of jobs and men have other different types of jobs. So we're also looking at differences in pay between, types of jobs. Like you were at some point talking about this case from Birmingham, and I think that would be very interesting if you could just explain this here, what happened in Birmingham, because I think that probably is the worst case scenario for most companies. It's like the nightmare of gender pay gap issues.
Yeah, so we can dig into that a little bit. And again, I'm not a lawyer. I didn't study the case by law cases, so bear with me if there are some tiny bits that could be interpreted slightly differently. But overall, the city of Birmingham, I think this was back in 2011, they had kind of two groups of employees. Overall, I'm simplifying a bit here for the sake of the example, but two groups of employees that did work of similar value to the municipality and to the city of Birmingham. And one was let's just call them cleaning ladies to make it very overall, and then the garbage men. So these two types there were also some other additional types within this, but these are kind of the big groups. I believe it was around 400 individuals. So it's a relatively small group of people. Now, they're on different labor agreements. They have different union agreements, and thereby they begin negotiating separately. And then many would say, well, then that's that. It doesn't matter then. They have a union agreement. It's fine. And then the union representing the cleaning ladies and a few other areas basically said, well, we are doing work of equal value. We want to make sure that we also have equal pay, or pay equity in this case. And it turned out that the garbage men, again simplifying, they basically had a few extras that they got to. One thing was kind of the base salary, but they also got some extras, for example, for noise and smell and these kinds of things, which sounds fair, right? Objectively, that sounds fair. But then comes my statement in this, that if you are a garbage collector and you take the trash on the outside of a school from a big container, that is smelly. But if you're a cleaning lady, cleaning the school toilets, and by the way, emptying the small trash bin, it is equally smelly, if not worse. And I think it's also fair to say that that is work of equal value. So that was kind of the, again, simplified argument that this is work of equal value. It should be the pay equity should be in place. And in this case, the union representing this female group won the case that this was discrimination due to gender. And the fine that was given to the authorities, which was partly a fine and partly back pay to all of these individuals for all the years they've been working, getting a lower salary, ended up being 1.1 billion pounds, which is a nightmare number. We also know there's an ongoing case with the Tesco at the moment, and we're potentially looking at numbers that are even bigger. So who knows how that's going to be ruled. But there are a number of cases, and they're all very big numbers. It doesn't mean that you directly translate this and say how many cases do we have and what kind of numbers. We can also have different rule cases. But I think it is fair to say that the European Court of Justice will make sure that whatever fines that you see and whatever things that is coming out of this, if a company systematically has been paying incorrectly and discriminating, that's going to be a major issue. So if there's any suspicion that there could be bits and pieces or parts of your company that has these kind of groups, look into it now and see if you can remedy some of these things now and potentially get ahead of the legislation. You need to fix it anyway. So why not have a look at it now, own the narrative, and make sure you can basically potentially fix it before it becomes a massive issue.
Exactly. And when we do enter into 2026, and if you are reporting an equal pay gap of more than 5%, then you're going to have this joint assessment.
Joint pay assessment, yeah.
Yeah. So that basically means that, someone who's not your company is going to take major part in deciding how your company is going to fix the issue. So if you want to sort of own the process yourself, you need to fix it now. Otherwise, you will have the social partners involved in how you're going to fix it. So yeah, definitely our recommendation to start looking into it now, to knowing, do I have an issue? What is the size of my issue? And to make a plan for how to remedy the issue in the cases where you find issues. Because one budget cycle may not be enough.
I would even go so far as saying it isn't enough. There are going to be areas where you need to do something. And that kind of, maybe that should be summing it up a bit, because reality is, we've been saying from the offset, this is not just a rewards issue. This is not just a comp&ben HR issue. Finance needs to get involved. And frankly, in many cases, so does the executive leadership team and potentially the board. If you need to go back and ask for extra money that isn't currently in the budget, you identify issues, you identify cases, and it frankly costs you 3, 4, 5 percentage points more than you have, you may need to go to your shareholders. And I would suggest that you really do your research well. And if you need to go all the way to that, you probably shouldn't wait till last minute. That is not recommended. To
bring in a historical and actually quite important perspective on this is that in 1976, the European Court of Justice had a ruling on Article 119. Article 119 is from the Rome Treaty, is the article that basically states that men and women have right to equal pay for work of equal value. But what the European Court of Justice ruled was that an individual can rely on Article 119 against companies or other individuals, even if the national legislation hasn't been implemented yet. So even if your local country does not have their pay transparency laws ready by June 2026, well, any individual within the European Union still has the right to this information because it's in a directive. So as a company, you cannot just sit back and say, well, I'll wait and see, what's going to be the national implementation in the different countries in which I have employees. No, you really need to own this. You need to bring this back to your own company and say, well, how am I going to deal with this? How are we going to ensure that we are a fair paying employer, that we have equal pay, and the minimum requirements because they're in the directive. So, of course, there will be places that, they're going to be stricter. Like we were talking about the 5%. Well, it looks as if they're going to be 3% in Sweden. We talked about reporting requirements for 100 employees. Well, they might be 10 employees in France and so on and so forth. But you know what the minimum requirements are. And the preparation work that needs to get done is the same, regardless if the reporting requirement is 100 or 10. Or if, the legal gender pay gap can be 5% or just 3%. You still need to get all your ducks in a row. You need to get your job architecture in. You need to look at your salary bands. You need to do all of this, cleanup preparation, have your pay policy in place, owning your narrative. So all of that work can be done, even if the politicians are still working out, the nitty-gritty details of your local legislation.
So in the end, we're basically saying, make sure you have a full overview of this, make sure you get started now and involve the right stakeholders, make sure you have top management buy-in, and make sure you have basically potentially the right team to get moving on this. Great. Thank you so much. This was a nice and nerdy long chat around the EU Pay Transparency Directive. We could have kept on going for a couple of more hours easily. We need to dig into some of these things in more detail in other episodes when we have slightly different angle, slightly different guests, etc. But we hope that you found this to be a good intro as to how the directive is, what it takes, with some real-life examples and interpretations. And we just want to say anything that we're saying is basically our own opinions when it comes to these things. We make some statements, and we're going to continue doing that. We need to think it's important to be clear that we actually also have some very firm beliefs in some of these things, and we're going to express them as we see them.
Yeah, and we would love to hear what you think about this. So if anything we've said in this episode has, brought questions forth, just feel free to contact us. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can email us at hello@nordicrewardpartners.com. We'll, take your questions. Maybe we'll try to answer them in a future episode. We'd certainly be happy to have the dialogue and to hear what you're thinking, what barriers you're facing out in your companies. If you have a special approach to how you're going to solve this, that would be very interesting to share with the listeners. Please reach out. And you know what, Jon? I think we forgot to say who we were when we began this episode. So just to sum it up, my name is Marie. I'm a partner and CMO at Nordic Reward Partners. And
I'm Jon. I'm the founder of Nordic Reward Partners and been dealing with this nerdy stuff for 20 plus years. So thank you so much for listening. It's been a huge pleasure, and we hope to see you again in the next episode or hear us again in the next episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have an amazing day.